A producer's main job is to help care for the cast, crew, locations, and much more on a film set. And a great place to start doing that is by having the right insurance coverage in place to make sure that everything is protected from damage, theft, or injury on your production. That's why on today's episode of the Producer Podcast, I'm sitting down with Kat from Athos Insurance to start exploring the world of film and entertainment insurance. So without further ado, let's get started. Thank you very much, Kat, for coming on to the Producers Podcast today.
All right, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So to start, maybe just tell me a little bit about yourself and like what got you interested in the entertainment sphere of the insurance industry.
Yeah, so my name is Kat Wong. I'm the owner of Athos Insurance. And all we do is entertainment insurance. We don't do anything else except entertainment and some sports insurance as well. Um, so that's been really fun. I actually got into insurance only because when I was going to school, I went to UCLA, by the way. Woohoo, Bruins! But I got a job just to pay for my car, and I was at an insurance company. And funnily enough, they actually did some entertainment insurance, so I kind of learned a little bit about it. But that's actually how I got my feet wet into extreme sports. So I did a lot of like
Okay.
skate park insurance and stuff like that. And after I graduated college, it was either be an accountant or do the insurance thing. And everyone advised to try the insurance thing because it's very stable and all that. So got into it. Years down the line, I actually left that company and joined an entertainment insurance brokerage. And then that's when I just fell in love with all of it. And it was so much more fun than, the auto and the homeowners and things. Not that that's bad,
Hmm.
but it was way more interesting to me. It allowed me to be more creative. And I was heavily, interested in the tech side of things. So kind of like automating processes and making it, more efficient, more profitable, because that's when all of that was really starting. And so that's how I got into that. And then a few more years later, got more experience and then started my own company.
Nice. I guess maybe just kind of starting like big picture, let's kind of break down what are the main types of insurance that as a filmmaker you're going to need when you're doing a project.
Yes. So I'll kind of just go over the basics. So the first one that everyone usually gets, right, is called general liability insurance. Okay. So just to kind of explain what that is, general liability insurance is going to cover your third party bodily injury claims. Okay. So that's not your cast or your crew, right? Because those are people who are on the set, they work for
Hmm.
you. These are third parties who are like not, like bystanders, spectators, people who have nothing to do with your production. So whenever you go rent a space, let's say it's like a restaurant, the first thing the restaurant's going to want is the general liability insurance, right? To cover in case someone sues them because of something you did, they don't want to get dragged into it. So I would say almost everywhere you go and rent a location, they're going to ask for that. That's the first
Hmm.
thing. And even permit offices, right? That's the first thing they're going to ask for. And then, as an addition to general liability, sometimes it's part of the general liability policy and sometimes it's outside of it, but it's what's called third party property damage. And that's actually super important to get. And if you're not careful and you just say, hey, I just want a general liability policy, and a broker doesn't really understand the ins and outs of it, they may set you up with a general liability policy that doesn't cover the third party property damage. And that's really risky for you because what that covers is if you, let's say, damage the space. Okay.
Okay.
So let's say you go into the space. I don't know. Let's say when you were moving things around, you ruined the hardwood floors, right? And now they're like, hey, you got to pay for all these hardwood floors to replace and all that. And you got a bill for like 25 grand. That's going to be part of the third party property damage. And if anything, to be honest, that's what we see the claims is
Okay.
that. Okay, so it's super important to have those two together. At Athos, we don't sell a policy without that. Even if it's more expensive, we are just not comfortable like not offering that unless tell us in writing and you're comfortable with that
Hmm.
without it. So that's the basics. Now, the other one that's very important, and a lot of people actually reach out to us about, is the equipment insurance, right?
Okay.
So this is going to be your equipment rentals, covering gear, maybe your production owns, right? So a lot of production companies, they own equipment and they probably already have a policy to cover that year round. But most of the time for like a short project, they're going to need to cover the rentals, right? This is like
Hmm.
all the gear you're going to rent from a rental house and things of that nature. And just to be very clear, there are a lot of projects that do happen where they really don't need to cover the location for whatever reason. Let's say it's like someone's house they know, they're just not even, thinking about that kind of a exposure. There's no spectators around and they're comfortable with taking that risk. Then they just want to cover the gear rental. And
Right.
that we do all the time, like just covering the rentals and nothing else. um, so there's a couple of variations there. So again, with the equipment insurance, that's going to cover, like theft or accidental damage of the equipment. Because if you are, renting an RA Alexa Mini, you don't want to be responsible for that if that thing gets stolen. That's a big ticket item, and you
Hmm.
don't want to be financially responsible for that. And the rental house won't let you walk off their premise without the certificate of insurance, right? So that's a big one. That's what we sell a lot of. And then on top of that, you have other coverages, right? So when it comes to your cast or your crew, their injuries, the big one is the workers' compensation
Hmm.
insurance, right? And this one's a tough one because it is very expensive, right? So, but it's very necessary, especially if you're concerned about, cast or crew members. And this would even cover in most states if it is a 1099, right? So
Okay.
so even if they're not a W-2 employee, they're a 1099, the work comp should cover them if that 1099 doesn't have his or her own, workers' comp insurance.
Hmm.
So it's pretty important in that sense, but it's very expensive. So a lot of people, they can't afford it. It's not a SAG production, let's just say. Then they are like, well, I can't afford it's like over $1,000 just to cover the work comp sometimes to add it. So then we have something else that we kind of offer as like a maybe just get this instead, so you're not completely naked. But it's called like an accident medical policy,
Okay.
and what that covers is just medical out of pocket medical reimbursement. So like let's say you have your health insurance, but on set, something happened, you had to call an ambulance, right?
Hmm.
And so now it's past your health insurance deductible, you're out, $1,000, even, all that. So the accident medical policy will actually pay for medical related expenses, while doing the film shoot that are out of
Okay.
pocket. Yeah. So that one, it starts at like 10,000 per person per accident, and it can go up to 100,000. So that one we sell actually a lot of because it's only a couple $100 compared to, over 1,000.
Hmm.
So again, we work with all sizes, right? We can work with the big productions and we work with the tiny ones. So we have to have all these options available because everyone's at different price points and levels when they come to us. So we try to explain all the things. So that's that for the cast and crew. And then, to on top of that, right? Like, let's say you have a really large production and very big budget, and now you have a large, like a big namer, right,
Hmm.
on set. So that's another coverage called like cast coverage, right? And that's to cover, if they're like sick or like that particular actor actress can't be there, and there's now like cost to the production because of this, right? So that we usually sell only to like the much larger projects,
Hmm.
where the talent is like is like the factor for like that project, right? So you want to make sure that's there. Okay, so now going down the list, because sorry, there's a few more.
That's
Then
okay.
there's the auto insurance, right? So auto insurance is usually used for when you're going to rent, your large grip trucks, vehicles, even prop vehicles, right? That's going to cover when you're renting it. So, let's say it gets damaged, right? Or you're driving the truck and you hit a wall. Let's just say you're going to be responsible for those things.
Hmm.
In addition to that, if you hit somebody and that person has, like injuries, they're going to sue you. So you want to have the auto liability. The proper name for it is non-owned and hired auto liability and physical damage. So that's the full coverage for when you are using vehicles. So that's an important one. And then the other type I would just say, that you might see is if you're working with, let's say, a bigger venue or, I don't know, it just depends like, on these insurance requirements, but you may need higher limits than the standard 1 million liability.
Hmm.
So that's where you need something called excess or umbrella, which just basically adds another layer, like another million on top of the liability. So we only see that for certain places, generally like New York, I would say those big buildings, we see that a lot and they don't waive those. But we don't really see that often. And then I would say the last one that we also work with, just kind of at the tail end of the production is this is like after the production's done. This is after, let's say you've been picked up and now you're going to get distributed. And that's the errors and omissions or the media
Hmm.
liability. So that's going to usually come into play, when you're starting to talk about a distribution agreement, then we help, our clients. And it's super exciting, right? Because it means that they got picked up. And then we help them to get the E&O insurance. And that is always a factor of the distribution agreement because that's going to set the terms, the coverage, the time, how long is the contract for, right? And we want to make sure we set it up so it all lines up properly with that. And then there's like, enough coverage for the term of that agreement. But yeah, so I know that's long, but that is literally the laundry list of all the insurance policies we usually provide to productions. And again, it depends like on the size and, scale of that production.
Hmm. Yeah, and that was kind of gonna be like my next question is like, how do like the type of film, whether it's like a short film or a documentary or maybe even a commercial, how does that maybe affect what you're needing to get?
Yeah, yeah. So for sure, and I kind of touched on this earlier, is it's all about the size and the scale, right, of that
Hmm.
project. Because if you're just going to film, talking heads in a small studio for a couple hours, most likely that's going to need very minimal insurance, maybe some general liability for the location and equipment, right?
Right.
And then, but if you're talking about a very large feature or a very high level budget film, with let's say a very big name cast member, that's when you're going to need the other coverages like the cast coverage. You're probably going to need a much larger policy than just like a cheap production insurance policy. And then
Hmm.
similar, right? If it gets picked up, that's when we deal with the E&O. So yeah, so again, we always say like, come all, we will help with all types. We see budgets that are like zero budget,
Hmm.
nothing for free. And then we see ones in the millions, so we try to help with all of them, and so yeah, it really just kind of depends on what you're doing. Also, if you're having like stunts or like special hazards, I guess one thing I did forget to mention was, we have a lot of like drone operators,
Yep.
right? So we also provide the aviation insurance for these drone operators. And so, sorry, that was one more I didn't mention. But yeah, if let's say the project has a bunch of stunts and now you're dealing with pyrotechnics and all that, then we have to deal with a lot other things, right? To make sure that the insurance carriers are even comfortable with it. And then, what's all involved to get all that done. So yeah, lots of fun stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And
Mhm.
that was speaking of stunts, like maybe go into a little bit like what constitutes a stunt? Because I know on my first
Mhm.
project that I was getting insurance, I was kind of surprised by, oh, like you consider that a stunt because, you just don't in the normal world really think about that. But it's like,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, and it's very interesting because, let's be real, there's actually only a handful of insurance companies that properly write
Hmm.
entertainment insurance. It's not like there's so many lining up, kind of like homeowners and auto. It's a very niche business. And so there's not that many insurance carriers that actually write this, number one. So they are the ones that actually have all the data, right?
Yeah.
That backs up why they have to ask these questions. And it's all tied to claims. And you would be like, well, why does that have to do? But it's like, well, believe it or not, there were claims that actually there's the pattern that they see that this thing is what actually created more claims, right?
Hmm.
So a couple examples, just so you can kind of think about it. Obviously, pyrotechnics, right? That's a big one because we're dealing with explosives, fire, all that kind of stuff. So that's just going to be more risky than a production with talking heads, right?
Yeah.
So you got that. Then you have like the fight scenes, right? Like, or like,
Hmm.
let's say choreographed fight scenes and stunts. And yeah, people are like, but I'm just falling. I'm literally just falling. Like, that's not very hazardous to some people, but it's more than someone just interviewing someone, right? So there's all of these classifications, and just because it's classified as a stunt, it doesn't mean it's going to get the surcharge of like the highest stunt, right?
Hmm.
There's like many levels of stunts. And that's why when they surcharge for these things, it could be very minimal. It could be nothing at all. Or it could be, yeah, you got to pay a lot more for that. But because it's different than just sitting there and just filming something pretty low risk, they have to know about it. Right. And that's what it's all about, is scheduling it. And that's why you have to be very upfront, right? When you apply, you want to make sure you're telling everything, because the last thing you want is you actually had a claim on something you didn't disclose. And then they actually can have the right to be like, well, that wasn't disclosed. And maybe they're not going to cover it now. You don't want that. I don't, that may not happen, but it could, right? So you want to make sure that you're very upfront with everything that you're doing and all the activities. Um, so yeah, so I'm trying to think of like some other stunts. I mean, there's animals, right?
Hmm.
So you can have farm animals, you can have horses, you can have more risky animals, like, exotic ones. And then what are some other stunts? Yeah, it's just like, guns, right? Obviously, we all know.
Yeah.
There's like, you have weapons, you can have prop guns, non-firing guns, but then you have these productions with actual guns, like we all know about, right? And that's very risky. So just all these things, they can really determine, the level of risk. So that's why they have to ask it.
For sure. Um, so I guess maybe getting in like you're talking to about like disclosing,
Yeah.
information to the insurance company. What things as like the producer should you have figured out before you sit down with the insurance company to start looking at what type of
Yeah.
policy you need and getting a quote and all that?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. And we understand that things change a lot, right? So sometimes like you could start early and start applying for the insurance, thinking it's going to be, this type of production, this direction. And then let's say halfway through, they're like, actually, we want to do all these things. So all I would recommend for that is that you always update, your
Hmm.
broker or agent that you're working with, anytime you make a change. Don't assume, oh, I already, applied, I'm good. Don't assume that, because yeah, if you add things or change things, it could actually change everything, about the type of insurance we even set up.
Hmm.
So one thing in general, which I really try to, my whole team, we always try to help people be as organized and efficient as possible. Um, the first thing we always recommend is to get all of your insurance requirements. That should be step one. Okay. Because wherever you film, let's say it's a location or whatever permit you need, that's almost like a blueprint for the type of insurance that you're going to have to get. Right. So if you need a film permit that has all these crazy requirements, right, you want to make sure that your broker knows that. And then we can properly plan for it. Right. So it's tough, because the first thing you probably want to know is, are there going to be stunts? What are we filming? What's our budget? What's this about? But also, just as equally important is your locations.
Hmm.
right? And the rental houses you're going to work with, and all the vendors you're going to work with. And those insurance requirements are going to dictate how we set up our policy, right? So that's if someone can, if you can do that every time, you'll save yourself a lot of headache. And with that, which I kind of want to just give some advice here, is every time you receive those requirements, don't just sign it and say, okay. Okay. Always look at them and read it, even go through it with your broker. Like at Athos, we always
Hmm.
say, let me see the requirements, because I'll say half, maybe majority of the time, those insurance are going to list everything in the world of what they want. And I would say most of the time, if you go back and discuss your situation with them, they'll waive most of those.
Okay.
So for people who are like, oh, I have to meet all these requirements, when we look at it, we're like, this is like a $10,000 policy. This is not going to work, right? And so we usually try to encourage our clients to go back and just say, hey, we this is our situation. We don't have these, X, Y, and Z. Can we now waive all these requirements? Because a lot
Hmm.
of times they're actually very ridiculous, to be honest. They're not stuff that really even apply or you really won't need. Um, and so I would just say, even in doing that, you're saving yourself the headache of discussing that up front, right? Versus
Right.
at the last minute before you're gonna, go on set tomorrow, and they're like, where's this insurance? And then everyone's like, kind of freaking out. so,
Hmm.
so that's what we actually deal with a lot, and we try to encourage our clients to do that up front, right? To prevent that. Yeah, and to negotiate, right? There's the art of negotiation everywhere.
Yes,
so, yes.
that is for sure. No, and
Mhm.
that's, I've never thought about doing that before, so that's a good tip that I
Yeah,
just learned for my
good.
next one.
I'm glad to share anything I can to help to help you guys.
Yeah. So then, I guess I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about like what does the quote process look like at Athos? Like what can people expect? Is it a phone call with somebody? Is it all online? Like what does that all look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say it all depends, right? So if you just need equipment insurance and that's it, you can actually go right to our website, and we have that whole platform. We spent, many years and dollars just, we constantly improve it and build out on it. And that's just for the equipment insurance. Or if you're renting, let's say, equipment from a rental house and they also just need the liability insurance just for the rental, right?
Hmm.
We actually have a kind of like a bare bone policy to cover that. And the reason how we're able to get that so cheap is because it's just covering the liability associated with the gear, right? It's not going to
Okay.
cover you to go into the location, and it's not going to cover you to get permits. It's just for that purpose. Because a lot of people we work with, they're so, they're not dealing with high budgets, right? They're just dealing with, like something very minimal. And yeah, so that's why we have that. And because all they need is the equipment insurance, but some of these rental houses will require the liability in order to rent it. And that's why we have that thing we can add on. But yeah, so that's the equipment. Now, when it comes to like productions, like you need a lot more coverages, then we have our online applications for short-term productions. We also have our online applications for annual productions. And we are constantly trying to update those all the time because it's always changing.
Hmm.
And so it is, yeah, sometimes it's a bear to fill it out, but it's to the point now where when you fill it out, we should have almost most of the information to at least get you an estimate, because we've all been doing this for quite some time, that when we have all those fine details of the production, we can already tell you it's going to be around this much, and we're usually pretty accurate. And so then for somebody who's actually really interested, they could either be like, that's out of my budget, What can we do to shave this down? Or, okay, great, let's proceed. And then we actually
Hmm.
get the quote they can pay for. And, we're really fast. So if we have that, okay, for me, we'll get you a quote usually by that day. Right. So it's more just to kind of make sure we're all on the same page, because oftentimes when we give an estimate, it's like so above, what our clients are able to even afford, that then we have to start talking about chiseling down coverages and, suggestions and how are we going to make this work. And that's when a lot of, our efforts kind of go into helping them get what they need, right? With the
Hmm.
budget that they have. Um, so yeah, so that's really the typical process. I would say the annual policies, like if you're trying to get a policy for the whole, your whole company for the whole year,
Hmm.
those take I would say at least like 3 or 4 business days, at
Okay.
least. Yeah, and sometimes even a week. It just depends on the season, right? If it's super busy, sometimes, it takes a little longer for our carriers to get back to us. But
Hmm.
generally we work very quick. We don't sit on anything. Our rule is we don't leave things unresponded to, after a certain time. Obviously, if you email it us at night, no one's there checking it, but we're always during our business hours, we're always going to respond, and we always pick up the phone too. I don't know if you've ever called us, but we always have someone picking up our phones.
Nice. That
Yeah.
I like to hear that because yeah, as a producer, I've made lots of phone calls where nobody is answering.
Exactly, exactly. And that's very frustrating. That's why we, highly prioritize that.
Hmm. For sure. Um, so at least in a lot of the projects I've worked on, another factor I've kind of noticed is that sometimes the state you're filming in will kind of
Mm.
affect what what you're needing or things like that.
Yeah, so I would say when it comes to the state, it's probably going to be their workers' comp requirement, right? Because some states they require it and some don't.
Hmm.
But also, what I think more affects it is the permit office, right? So the permit office of that state is going to have certain requirements, and that could actually be where you're seeing the variation, because sometimes, like I would say in California, right? If you're filming in Los Angeles, their requirements are pretty, I mean, they have a lot of requirements, right?
Yeah.
Versus actually in New York, I noticed there's not much. It's just
Interesting.
general liability. So it really, I think it actually comes from the permit office in that specific state. And then, just certain types of coverages, if it's the workers' comp, it's required based on the state law, right? Is it required or
Hmm.
not? So that's usually what we have seen.
Okay. Good to know.
Okay.
Let's jump back and talk a little bit more about E&O
Okay.
insurance and yeah, like when should you start working to get that?
The E&O.
What all info do you need to know to be able to get that policy and everything?
Yeah, yeah. So for E&O, it's going to be highly dependent on the distributor, right? So I would say once you're going to get your film is getting picked up, I would then start reaching out to your broker or Athos to talk about how to get the E&O for this distribution agreement.
Hmm.
And usually we'll then send you an application, but it'll be really hard to fill that application out if you don't have that sample distribution agreement,
Okay.
because that agreement will tell you like I was saying before, like the limits, the time, right? Is it a 1 year or 3 year policy? How long is it going to take for you guys to disseminate the project, which is like to air the project? Because it could be in a year or it could take 3 years to actually air it. So
Hmm.
that's where we would set up the E&O according to that. Because the E&O activates the moment the first time it airs.
Okay.
So that's the whole like driving factor, is that's why you have either a 1 year policy or a 3 year policy, because it could take a long time to air it for the first time. And so
Hmm.
that's when it actually starts. And then it covers until the end of the entire term, right, of that agreement. And so it's very important to make sure to just start talking to the broker, but you really to get a copy of even a draft or sample of that distribution agreement, so that we can line it up and quote accordingly to what that distribution agreement says.
Okay. Yeah. And then maybe just jumping in a little bit, if people aren't super familiar with what all errors and omission insurance is used for, just kind of talk a little bit about like what types of claims and things is that actually protecting you from?
Yeah, so the errors and omissions, or otherwise known as media liability, it's really covering the content of your film. Okay, so especially like let's say in your film you use a trademarked item in there or a
Hmm.
product or logo even, right? That you didn't get the permission to use, you can get sued for that, right? So most of the time when we're dealing with E&O insurance, you have to work with a clearance attorney or an attorney that actually goes through your whole film and make sure everything has been checked off basically and cleared,
Okay.
because otherwise the insurance carrier is not going to insure it if no one's actually like gone through that process,
Hmm.
because then they're just leaving, it all exposed. Now even if they do that, there could even be something, it could be anything. It could be something you say that was, like someone's going to sue you for something that's like slander or defamation or just something that's incorrect. But really what it's for is like those trademarks, those trademark infringements, right? Or intellectual property. So you're making sure that you do that. So it is more difficult, right? Depending on the topic of the film, right? If it's very political, if it's, it doesn't mean you can't get the insurance, but it's just a lot more underwriting involved. So,
Right.
but that's really why you need it. And that's why no, studio or distributor is going to distribute it until you have that insurance in
Hmm.
place, right? Before they air it out for the world to see, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Um, so then uh starting to kind of wrap things up here, like
Mhm.
what are some of the common misconceptions or maybe misunderstandings you see filmmakers have about insurance and the process of getting it and everything?
Yeah, so this is a really great one. So the one thing I will say, and I'm not just saying this because I sell the insurance, I'm saying it because I've seen this backfire so many times, but cheap insurance is not always the best. I know it's great for the budget,
Hmm.
but there's usually a reason why it's cheap, right? So I know a lot of filmmakers get sucked into this idea also that you can buy insurance from other production companies. And that is completely incorrect and illegal, right? So you cannot sell insurance unless you're a licensed insurance agent, right? That means you've paid for your license, you've taken the courses, you have a license in that state, right? That person is getting insurance, and there's like a lot of fees that go with that, and the reason is because it's all highly regulated, right?
Hmm.
So if let's say someone's saying, hey, yeah, you can partner with me, I'll sell you my insurance and get you this COI, that feeling in the back of your head that's like, this seems a little weird, is correct, because that's absolutely wrong, right? And we've seen this happen actually many times where people present it like it's completely legitimate. They sell the insurance for what, 500, $1,000, right? Which is way cheaper than, proper insurance, I have to say, unfortunately. Um, and then let's say they do that, you'll notice that all the COIs or certificates of insurance, that's what COI stands for, are in the name of that production company and not yours, right?
Hmm.
All your contracts are going to be in their name, right? So that means you have zero control over anything. And so what we have seen is then a claim comes, right? A real claim, right? Let's say you drive the auto into a wall, and now the car company is going to charge you $30,000 to replace that grip truck, right? And now this company that you bought the insurance from is not going to file it. You see what I'm saying? And this is
Uh-huh.
we've actually seen this happen many times, right? And then it leaves the customer who paid the $1,000 up to, they're going to get sued, right? There's just nothing. And so
Right.
it's very unfortunate, and we see this very often. So if you catch wind of something like that, everything should be in your name always. right? Your
Okay.
production company, your contracts, it's yours, right? I know it's very tempting, right? Because it's like, oh, we don't have the budget, let's just do it to get through. And sure, maybe it'll work for many years, right? For people who've just kind of done this until you
Mhm.
actually need it. Right. I mean, I have a whole list of customers who come to us crying because this is what happened to them. And they will they're just so traumatized and they're like, we'll never leave ever because they're right. Because they've been traumatized. They've gone through the ringer with lawsuits. I mean,
Yeah.
it's terrible. So that's why I say don't that's a very tempting thing that's out there. It's not actually legitimate. So please be careful of that. And the other thing too is there's a lot of insurance online these days, which is it's great, right? I mean, we're even
Hmm.
online. Our equipment insurance is online, right?
Right.
But the scary part, right? Some of these things, we have a lot of clients who are like, oh, I have an annual insurance policy for, less than $1,000 for liability. And we're like, what? Where'd you get this from? So, and then we look at it a little deeper and there's several class codes. And this is something I always like to tell people. There's a class code in business, right, for videographers and photographers.
Hmm.
Okay. That's a very standard class code, which is like a business type that almost any insurance company can provide. Because when they're thinking videographer, photographer, they're thinking family portrait studios, people who film weddings, baby showers, bar mitzvahs. It's a very different thing.
Right.
So the moment you're doing production work like documentaries, commercials, educational videos, anything other than that, TikTok videos, who knows, right? Whatever you're making, that's actually the class code is called a DICE producer. That's what it stands for: documentaries, informational, commercial, educational. So when you get a policy for your business, that should be the class code you have. So when you see videographer, photographer, you want to be very careful with that because that may not be the right class. And
Hmm.
again, it's all about class and what happens when you have a claim, right? Then you get a claim and it's like, it was my documentary. And then now all of a sudden the claims adjusters are like, what is going on?
Yeah.
Right. And you may not even get it paid out. So very, you're basically paying this money for a piece of paper that may not work. Right. So it's very tough. And and it's hard because when you Google things, you look online, you say, film insurance, people will word it very oddly, and
Hmm.
if you're the one controlling it on the website, you may end up be buying the wrong type of insurance. Um,
Okay.
so that's one thing we do see a lot. And the other thing too is there are actual legit, products out there that are pretty inexpensive production insurance.
Hmm.
Um, and that does work if you only need liability, right? So if you have a project that you're going to need more than that, that's when we actually get a lot of clients coming to us and they're like, we bought this really cheap insurance for liability, but now we need to rent gear, we need to rent an auto. And then we end up just rewriting the whole thing. And then they lost the money that they paid on that cheap insurance because it's
Right.
not refundable, right? So that's also why, it's important as much as you can to know upfront what you need.
Hmm.
Um, there is a rule apparently out there that your insurance budget should be 3% of the budget.
Okay.
I I don't know who came up with that. I think it maybe sometimes works for large productions, but
Hmm.
when we're talking about tiny productions, if your budget, is I don't know, let's say your budget's like $1,000, it's not going to cost $30, So
Hmm.
it's just like I think it really depends because if you have a very small budget, you're going to be hitting these minimum premiums for
Right.
insurance, and that's why sometimes it's like the insurance is as much as the budget, when it's small
Hmm.
like that. So just kind of being educated about these things, it will help when you're actually trying to set up the insurance. But yeah, those are my big takeaways. Those are the things we have counseled many film producers through. We sometimes we're like therapists. We're like, I'm so sorry, like you went
Hmm.
through that, and a lot of people just kind of get strayed the wrong way. So we obviously feel really bad about that, and we hear them and we try to like help them, and just say, just stick with us. You
Yeah.
can get guided the right way.
Oh, no, that's all good to know. I had never heard of the whole another company, production company trying to like sell their insurance. So thankfully
Yeah,
I haven't
yeah.
dealt with that, but
Yes,
good to know.
thankfully. Thankfully.
So then for like filmmakers out there where maybe they're doing like their first project at a level that it needs insurance, what would be like a piece of advice you would give them?
I would just say don't let insurance be the last thing on your list. Try to have it be maybe one of the first or at least the middle of your
Mm-hmm.
list, because the the people who are last minute, I would have to say they are the most stressed, right? And making a film is already stressful. I get that. There's a lot going on. A lot of times things get greenlit so last minute, right? But when insurance is so last minute that you're basically pressuring the broker to turn it around within an hour or two, it's very difficult, for us, right? We can pull magic, but sometimes we do it and there's going to be mistakes that are made, right? There's miscommunication that happens. So you're almost like creating your own detriment, by
Mm-hmm.
like doing that. So I would just say the more time you can provide, the better, right? We always ask for at least a full business day. Even that I think is pretty fast.
Yeah.
Even 2 business days. But for people who, want it in an hour, it's very difficult to do it well. Um, and also, sometimes if you are doing everything last minute and you're kind of adding things on as you go, you'll end up spending a lot more money than you needed to had you known what you needed in the first place,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because, a lot of people, they try to navigate and they say, oh, you only need liability here, and they'll get you a cheaper liability quote. But then later you'll need auto, work comp, or all those other things, which you can't buy on its own. So you have to buy that with the liability. So you'll end up needing to buy another policy anyways, and then you just wasted all that money on the other one that you bought. So that's my only thing. Be organized, try not to wait till the last minute, or try to give insurance a little more priority
Mm-hmm.
when doing it, especially it is the thing that will hold up the production if you don't
Yeah.
have it taken care of. And that's frustrating for everyone. So yeah, that those are my pieces of advice.
Awesome. Uh, so then kind of our easy final wrap up question is like, where can people go to get in touch with Athos for their next insurance need?
Yeah, so we are always available on our website, right? That website, you can buy the equipment insurance anytime online, 24/7. But we are open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 5:30, and we are West Coast time. So for the East Coasters, it's nice because we're open a lot longer
Uh-huh.
for them. And we're licensed in all 50 states. But I would just say call us or email us. We even have a chat function now, but those are all available during our business hours. So that's the best way. And like I said, we're not, you call us and we will help you. Like we're not, just like an answering service, and, we
Mm-hmm.
don't just like have a voicemail that like people have to call back. We will answer you. So even if you're just like trying to get a estimate, or you just have this thing coming up, you can always email us, and at least we can have a conversation, or email, what do you need, help you prep for it. But yeah, all those ways of communication, I would say, are the best.
Awesome. Well, we'll go ahead then and wrap up this episode. But yeah, this is a really good time. I learned a lot. So thanks so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Of course, anytime. Thank you.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Producer Podcast. I'm your host, Micah Versman. And until next time, make sure to subscribe to the Producer Podcast, follow us on social media, and thanks for listening.